Hey, how many of you have seen the movie The Greatest Showman? Anybody? Yeah. For the rest of you, what is your problem? I went and saw it a week or so ago. I had a lot of friends talking about it. I read the reviews, a little mixed reviews from the critics, but which made me think you should definitely go. And so I went to the movie. I had some friends telling me all about it, and they said it was fantastic. They said there's a lot of singing. And I thought, did they blow anything up? Is that going to happen? And they said, no, but there's really good music. And I thought, okay, well, I'll do this for my wife, be a good husband. So I went to the movie. I got to tell you, it's one of the best movies I've seen, maybe ever. It's definitely the best movie I've seen in a long time. Now, don't take that for too much. I don't go to the movies very much. I have 4 kids, so I spend my time doing that. But it was incredible. I won't spoil it for you, but you should know in the movie, that song, This Is Me, is a part of the movie. And there's a moment in the middle of the movie where one of the girls, and really all of her kind of friends around her, have basically had enough. They've been living a life really disadvantaged, kind of disenfranchised. They've been being held back and kind of held down. And it happened one more time, and it was almost like that proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. She had just had enough. And so she goes into that song, and it is so powerful in the movie. It's unbelievable. Now, what I found out later is that during the kind of rehearsals for the song, this girl who sings it had felt that her whole life. She's a beautiful singer, but she had been on Broadway for a long time, which sounds awesome, but she had always been a background vocalist. She's always been kind of in the shadows, in the dark, in the background, and I think she had begun to believe that that's where she deserved to be, that's the kind of person that she was. And so as they're doing the rehearsals, she's standing on the side, really off to the side, and she's standing behind her podium, and she's singing it, but she's not really feeling it. She's just saying the words. And you can see the rest of the cast kind of around her, and they're kind of encouraging her to go out in the middle of the room and just own this song. It's her song, it's her anthem. But she's so hesitant because she's always been in the background. She's always felt like she wasn't good enough. She's always felt that she's at disadvantage. She's always felt that she's not worth it. She doesn't have what it takes to be the person. But then as the song gets going, you can see it in her heart and her spirit. You can almost see it. And she just can't take it anymore. And she moves the podium to the side, and she stands out in the middle of the rehearsal room and just lets go. And it's almost like she felt the words of the song for the very first time. It's almost like she realized that is her anthem. It's not just a song about, moving on. It's a song about her moving on. It's a song about her not being disadvantaged. It's just the most beautiful thing. On the way home from the movie, having known all that, on the way home from the movie, I just found myself singing that song over and over again. And I'm thinking about my kids. I've got 4, and 2 of them are girls. And I'm just thinking man, I hope they feel like if they have ever been put down, I hope that they ever feel disadvantaged, that song can be their anthem. And then I started thinking, I hope that song can be the anthem of anybody who has ever felt disenfranchised, anybody who's ever been battered or bruised, they feel like they can sing that song. And then I got home and I walked in the doors, and I started thinking about my kids. And I went upstairs and saw my daughter's rooms and began to think, what would be even better? Instead of them being able to sing that song, if they ever feel that way, what would be better? It would be better if they never felt that way. And it would be better if there was some way to have a world where songs like that just didn't even need to be written. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine a world? Can you imagine a world where songs like that aren't even necessary? Can you imagine a world where there is no disenfranchised groups? Can you imagine a world where everybody feels powerful, where everybody feels hopeful, where everybody feels like they have an equal standing and an equal chance? It's hard to imagine, but it sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Actually, a version of that world has existed before. It only lasted for a few minutes, but it was here. If you ever read the beginning of the Bible, that's really where it starts. It's in the beginning. And here's how it's written. So God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. He created male and female uniquely different, but uniquely equal. The goal in the beginning was this beautiful partnership of all living things where thriving and flourishing was what would happen. And while male and female were definitely intended to be created differently, they were never intended to be treated differently. They were never intended to be not equal. That's how it was created in the beginning, or at least as the story goes. But It only lasted for about 10 minutes. And the reason is because of selfishness. It is the sin of selfishness that began to break apart the equality that God had tried to create and tried to instill in humanity from the very, very beginning. Selfishness is what destroys equality. Selfishness is what gets in the way of equality. And you know why? It's because selfishness causes people to use their advantage to take advantage. That's what selfishness does. When it comes to equality, selfishness causes people to use their advantage to take advantage. Self-interest is what sees differences in others and tries to capitalize personally on the differences. Selfishness is what birthed this desire in our hearts to dominate instead of cultivate. Self-interest kind of birthed this thing in us to exploit rather than encourage. Self-interest and the sin of selfishness is what causes us, when we see an opportunity to take advantage, and instead of lending a hand, our first instinct is to kind of use our hand to hold people down, to hold people back, if it's in our best interest. And while that wasn't God's intent from the very beginning, it didn't take long for that to become the norm in the world. And actually, that kind of selfishness birthed all of the isms that you know so well. You know what the isms are, right? It's things like racism and sexism and classism. All of the isms were birthed out of that sin of selfishness, that sin of self-interest, that thing in us that wants to take advantage for our own advantage, or that thing in us that just wants to exploit for our own gain. And all of those isms were birthed out of that desire, that instinctual sinful thing, and that really exists in every single one of us. And you know what's interesting? We're in this kind of conversation around Jesus, and Jesus walked the face of the earth in the first century. And if you were to kind of go back in time into the first century, what you would find is that all of these isms are alive and well. From the beginning of time until the first century, it didn't get better because might continued to make right, and people continued to leverage their power to dominate, not to elevate. And it didn't get any better. In fact, it just kept getting worse. And in the first century, it had gotten pretty bad. I mean, racism existed absolutely everywhere. Classism existed everywhere. But here's the interesting thing. Sexism in the religious community was maybe the worst of the worst. And it's ironic because the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the rabbis, they had memorized the Old Testament. They had memorized the Torah. They knew exactly what God had created. They knew, as the story goes, that God had created male and female equally, but differently, but equally. They knew that. Yet, they led the charge religiously, and women were treated as lesser than everybody. Maybe you know that. Like in the first century, women had absolutely zero status. They were not allowed to own anything. They had no possessions, although they were treated as a possession every time. They weren't allowed to give testimony. They couldn't be a witness in any sort of court. In fact, if a woman saw something that had gone wrong, no one could ask her for the description because her words didn't matter at all. None of it mattered. Religiously, it wasn't even easier for the women. If you were a woman growing up in a Jewish household, the boys were the ones encouraged to pursue faith, to pursue God, to pursue maybe eventually becoming a disciple or a rabbi, but no woman was ever encouraged to do that. I mean, think about how far it had gone. If you were a Jewish male and you were kind of growing up in the first century, you would have daily prayers every day. And as a part of your daily prayers, every guy would pray this: "Praise be to God that he has not created me a woman." Did any of you pray that today? Do not raise your hand if you did, okay? But I mean, that's kind of crazy, right? But that's the world that these women lived in. There was this famous rabbi, and he's kind of famous for a quote. Here's his quote: "Rather should the word of the Torah," the first 5 books of the Old Testament, "rather should the word of the Torah be burned," means destroyed, "than entrusted to a woman." Because who knows what she's going to do with it? I mean, right? I mean, religiously, if you were a woman wanting to practice this thing where you could connect with your Heavenly Father, with God, you were so limited in your ability. You know, the temple was the epicenter of faith in the first century for a Jewish person. And if you were a female, going to the temple wasn't really the greatest experience. Here's a quick diagram of the temple. There was a court of the Gentiles, which was classism. But if you were a woman and you walked in, you had a space. It was called the women's courtyard, the court of women. But you really couldn't even get into the temple. You couldn't experience the wholeness, the fullness of even the temple just because you were female. Now, granted, We've made a lot of progress since the first century, in a way. I mean, women's suffrage and the civil rights movement, that's come a long way. I mean, when you walked in this morning, right, none of us said to you in the parking lot, or none of our guest services volunteers said, oh, I'm sorry, you're a woman, I need you to stay in the rotunda for the service today. Only the guys get to go to the auditorium, right? I mean, can you imagine? But that's the world that existed in the first century. But as much as we want to think that we've made a lot of progress, I mean, the reality is that all those isms still exist, right? I mean, racism, classism, sexism, I mean, it's still here. It just looks a little different, but it's still here. And I realize we're not in the first century, but I don't know that we've made as much progress as we'd like. And here's why. Because the thing that birthed the isms in the first century is still alive and well in us today. You see, today, we are still tempted today. We're still tempted to use our advantage to take advantage. We're still tempted to see any sort of differences as an opportunity to gain personally. Today, we are still tempted through that same sinful self-interest, selfishness. We're still tempted to take advantage whenever we can, and in doing so, hopefully gain an advantage. Now, I don't know if that's easy for you to believe or not. I'll tell you, there were times in my life where I didn't think that was true. I thought that some people did that, but all people don't do that because I don't really have that many advantages, but we have a lot of advantages. In fact, every single one of us in this room has so many advantages. And I get it. It's hard to see advantage in the mirror because this is just how you grew up. This is just how things are. But we can so easily miss how advantaged we really are. If I could give you some examples really quick. Like if you're American, that's an advantage in the world. Because when people say, are you American? What they're really asking is are you from the United States of America? But when they say if you're American, I mean, we take the entire swath of the land masses of North, Central, South America, and we call it American just for us. Why? Because we are advantaged. That's why. No one ever says, are you American? Oh, I mean Argentinian. That's not the question. Are you American means us. If you speak English, you have an advantage. Yeah, almost everywhere in the world you go, if you speak English, you're probably going to be okay. But if you speak a different language and come here, it's going to be really tough. That's a disadvantage. You know why? Speaking English is just an advantage. If you have a home, you have an advantage. If you have a car, you have an advantage. If your cars have homes, that's an advantage. Like if you have a second car, it's a huge advantage. If your second car is a Jeep, you are way more advantaged than everybody else. That's an advantage in the spring, usually. It's a huge advantage. Think about this. If you're not worried about where you're going to eat your next meal, that's an advantage. This is a little harder, but if you have never been paid less for the same kind of work, you have an advantage. If you have never wondered if something bad might happen to you because of how you look or maybe because of the color of your skin, that's a huge advantage. It's a huge advantage. And I'm tempted to think about that and kind of beat myself up, but here's the real reality. The real reality is that it's just hard to see advantage in the mirror. It's hard to recognize that we have advantages. And the reason is because we look around us and see people who have more, who seemingly have it better. And so we begin to think that they are the ones who have the advantage. And it's true that they do have one, but we do too. We all do. In fact, we all have probably multiple advantages. But here's the point. See, having an advantage doesn't really make you prejudiced, but it does make you privileged. Having an advantage doesn't make you necessarily racist. It doesn't make you prejudiced. It doesn't make you sexist, but it definitely makes you privileged. And here is what Jesus constantly taught in the first century, over and over and over with his words and his actions. He constantly taught this, that just because you're a part of the privileged doesn't mean you have to be part of the problem. He was constantly reiterating this. Just because you have advantages doesn't mean that you have to leverage them against the disadvantaged. Just because you have a privilege doesn't mean you should be adding to the problem. In so many ways, we see this in the life and times of Jesus. John, who's one of the disciples, captured in the document of John the life and times of Jesus as he experienced them firsthand with him. And he writes of Jesus healing the sick, which was such a thing that people didn't do of privilege. If you're a rabbi, you would never kneel down with a sick person because a sick person was sick in their mind because of a sin they had committed or maybe a sin of their parents. But to put yourself on an even playing field in any way with a person who's sick, no one would do that. You would take advantage of them, but you wouldn't use your advantage for them. Jesus would see lepers. If you know about in the first century, if you had leprosy, it's a death sentence in every way, shape, and form, including relationally. If you had leprosy, you had to walk around with a bell to announce your presence so everybody could get away from you. And you remember what Jesus did? Jesus walked up and hugged them because he didn't see his privilege the way everybody else did. In every way, he used his privilege for the betterment of others because he never saw it as an entitlement or a right. He always saw it as a responsibility. My favorite story around this with Jesus is in the book of John, John chapter 4. Some of you have heard this story, but I want us to kind of read through it maybe from a slightly maybe from a different lens, really from the lens of what it looks like to be a part of the privileged. So here's how John starts it. Now he, Jesus, had to go through Samaria, which is funny that John wrote it this way because he didn't have to go through Samaria, but he chose to. Jesus and his disciples were traveling from Judea to Galilee, and there were multiple ways to do that. You could go through Samaria, which was the quickest way, but most everybody went around Samaria because while the Samaritans were Israelites, they were the lowest of the low in Judaism. The Jews had taken advantage of the Samaritans, and through classism and some other means, they had just become the disadvantaged of the Jews. And the Jews hated the Samaritans, including the 12 guys who were Jesus' disciples. So now they're getting ready to go to Galilee, and Jesus says, we're going to go through Samaria. And my guess is they all moaned a little bit because none of them wanted to be anywhere near Samaria because you know who lives there? The Samaritans. And we hate the Samaritans. So as they're walking to Samaria together, Jesus tells the guys, hey, I know you don't like these people. I need you to go ahead of me, though. Go into the city, get some Big Macs or some Whoppers or something, and then bring them back. I'm going to wait here at the Jacob's Well. Jacob's Well was a well that was on the outskirts of the city. Jesus says that he was a little tired. He was going to wait there while they go and get food and bring it back. Now, I think he did it on purpose because he's Jesus. He knows what's about to happen. So as he's waiting there, one of the most dramatic things possible happens. Here's how John writes about it. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? Now, it's easy to kind of go past that because, Jesus isn't traveling with buckets. This well is really deep. He's thirsty after the walk. But this should never happen. For one, she's a Samaritan and he's Jewish. Those people do not talk. Secondly, she's a woman and he's a man. And not only is he a man, he's a rabbi. He's a teacher of the law. He's the high religious person. There is no way that person should ever utter a word to this woman. But he does. In fact, it was so profound when the disciples come back, they can't believe it. They are speechless at what they're seeing. And if you know anything about the disciples, Peter was one of them. That guy was never short of words. And he is even speechless. It was a quick fast forward in the story. Here's what happens. When the disciples returned and they were surprised to find him, Jesus, talking with a woman, because it wasn't even just like hey, can you give me some water? It was this ongoing long conversation that he's having with her. But no one asked, what do you want? Or why are you talking to her? Do you know why no one asked that? Because they didn't even know what to ask. They were so confused. They were so befuddled by this conversation. Why in the world would Jesus, a man, Jewish rabbi, even utter a word to a Samaritan, let alone a woman? It just made no sense at all. This woman has nothing going for her. She's a Samaritan. She's a woman. She has no status, no possessions. And we find out later in the story that she's been divorced 5 times and now she's living with a man who's not even her husband. So not only is she a woman and she's a Samaritan, she has zero standing in even the Samaritan temple. She's ceremonially unclean. Her ability to connect with God has been ceased. In fact, when you think about this woman, she actually only has one thing going for her. She has one thing going for her. Do you know what it is? So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. When Jesus saw her, he didn't see Samaritan. He didn't see woman. He didn't see divorcee. He didn't see any of those things. When Jesus saw her, he saw her the way his heavenly Father saw her. He saw her as an equal creation in the image of God. He saw her as a child of God. So if we go back to the story for a second. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" And the Samaritan woman said to him, to Jesus, "You are a Jew." I mean, she has to remind him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" And then John, in parentheses, wanted to make sure you knew that shouldn't happen. I mean, the woman is even confused by this. When Jesus approaches her, she can't believe that he is even saying anything to her. I mean, maybe hurling insults possibly, but showing a level of kindness and asking for help. I mean, it's just incredible. In fact, it's even more incredible when you realize that this well isn't the closest well to her house. In fact, this woman has traveled past several other wells to get to this well, and she has gone in the middle of the day, not in the morning where all the other women go to get water. And you know why? Because she's not just a Samaritan woman that's a disadvantaged person. She's among the most disadvantaged of the disadvantaged. If there was any sort of like totem pole in Samaria, she's at the very bottom. I mean, she is the worst of the Samaritans in their eyes. So she's doing everything she can to avoid people. And here's Jesus talking with her. If you read the whole story, this beautiful conversation kind of continues. And he says, "Can you give me a drink of water?" And she says, "I can't believe you're asking me for that. Do you not know that I'm a Samaritan woman?" And then he says, "Well, if you knew who I was, you would ask me for something. You would ask me for living water, the kind that will help you never thirst again." When she heard that, she began to lean in because she's also Jewish, and she's waiting on the Messiah. She's hoping that God will intervene in the world as soon as possible so that the Jews can be risen up again to be the most powerful nation again, and guess what? Take advantage of the rest of the world again. That's what she thinks God's going to do. So she responds after that conversation. She says, "The woman said, 'I know that Messiah called Christ is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us.'" And then Jesus declares, "I, the one speaking to you," which by the way, shouldn't happen, "I am he." And she is so excited and confused that she drops her water jar on the ground and she sprints back to her village in Samaria. And on the way back, she is yelling to anyone who will even listen to anything she has to say. And here's what she's saying. She's saying, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did." Now, this is for next week's message, but she didn't get mad when Jesus confronted her about her stuff. That's interesting. Could this be the Messiah? They came out of the town and they made their way towards him. Now check this out. Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony, which by the way, she's not even allowed to give. And if she does give it, nobody will listen because she's a woman. She's not allowed to give testimony. She's not allowed to share a witness, but she did. And it changed everything for the town. Look, he told me everything I ever did, she continues. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them in Samaria, which he shouldn't do either. And he stayed 2 days in Samaria. And because of his words, many more became believers. This is unbelievable. I mean, this story is partially about salvation, but it's way bigger. It's way bigger than just that. See, here's something that Jesus knew. Jesus knew that it was a privilege to have privilege. Jesus fully understood that it was a privilege to leverage his privilege for others. It was a benefit to leverage his advantage to help those who were disadvantaged. And when he meets this woman at the well, he doesn't use his advantage to take advantage. He doesn't ignore the fact that he is privileged and she's not. He leverages his privilege to change her life. He leverages her power to empower her. He doesn't dominate. He chooses instead to cultivate. And that's different. It's dramatically different. And I think John, in writing this, wrote it this way for this reason. Because I think Jesus would say to us too that it's a privilege for us. It's a privilege for us to leverage our privilege. It's a privilege for us to recognize that we have advantage. And it's a privilege for us to leverage our privilege for the benefit of others. You see, that's actually the bigger point of this story. I think John included it in his chronology of Jesus' life because he learned it too. And as he was a part of this new church movement beginning, he worked hard to make sure that was a part of the movement because it was brand new thinking, but it was really important thinking. I don't know if you've ever read anything by Philip Yancey. He has a book called Vanishing Grace. I'd highly recommend it. It's incredible. But in his book, Vanishing Grace, he actually talks about this in a way. Here's a quote that we pulled. It says, human rights, think about this, human rights, civil rights, women's rights, minority rights, gay rights, disability rights, animal rights, all the rights you can think of. The success of these modern movements reflects a widespread empathy for the, and here's an important word, for the oppressed that has no precedent in the ancient world. Classical philosophers considered mercy and pity to be a character defect, contrary to justice, because might always makes right. Because when you have a chance to exploit, you do. When you have a chance to take advantage, you take advantage. That's the world as it has always been since about 10 minutes from the beginning. But not until Jesus did that attitude change. Do you know that the rights that you get to live out of today are because of Jesus? Even if you don't follow him, you should like him. And even if you don't believe in him, you should thank him. Because everything in our modern world that has been done in the way of giving rights to the disenfranchised, the disadvantaged, has been done in the name of Jesus. That's why. I love that Philip Yancey used that word empathy, because empathy is actually, I think, the solution, the secret sauce. It's the mechanism to confronting the problem, to confronting all the isms of the world. You know what empathy is, right? Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Empathy is the ability to understand that everybody doesn't see things the way that you see things. Empathy is the ability to see things from someone else's perspective. Empathy is difficult. But empathy gives you the ability to walk around to the other side and see what it's like to not be you, to see what it's like not to live as you, to see what it's like to have the advantages or the disadvantages that you don't have. That's what empathy is. And when it comes to equality, empathy fosters equality. Because the more we can understand about what it looks like on the other side of us, the more we will begin to root out the isms that exist in the world today. It is almost impossible, and I would say it is impossible, for racism to exist when empathy is present. It's impossible. It's incredibly difficult for sexism to flourish when empathy is employed. It's impossible for my privilege to feel like a right or an entitlement when I choose to relate and have empathy with someone else. It's impossible. Can I just give you some very specific examples? I've been thinking about this for a long time. And I'm going to give you some examples of things that I'm even trying to do. But I think there's examples of things that we all should probably figure out a way to employ in our lives. For those of us with a version of privilege. If you're in the workplace anywhere, if you're a boss or a leader, I'm a leader. We have a lot of staff members that work here, a lot of people who are around that in theory, I guess I'm responsible for. If you're a boss or a leader, empathy should cause you to see what it's like to not be you. I've tried to do that a lot. I've met with a lot of our female staff members, and I've asked them, what is it like to be a female in the workplace? What is it like to be a female working here? And I hated some of the answers I heard in the beginning. So I've been working really hard to understand through empathy what it looks like to be a female in the workplace. What does it look like to be a mom in the workplace? And you know what I've learned? I've learned that we shouldn't just treat moms specifically equally. We should treat them unequally because their job is way harder than ours. I've learned that we should create more flexibility for moms. I've learned that we should pay them the same, though, for the same job done. That's what empathy should cause us to do in the workplace. Can I keep going? If you're rich, if you're wealthy, empathy should reveal the fact that other people don't have what you have. And empathy should drive you to be generous. It shouldn't drive you to judge, and it shouldn't drive you to question, and it shouldn't drive you to assume that people in poverty made a bunch of mistakes and that's how they got there. No, empathy should cause you to be extraordinarily generous to other people. Did you know that there are people living in your same zip code who are begging God for the same advantages that we take for granted? Empathy should cause us to see that differently. If you're a man, it's getting real touchy. If you're a man, empathy should cause you to realize that it's a lot easier to be a man. It's just easier. And if you don't know that, it's okay. Because if you grow up a man, you just don't realize that it's true. But empathy helps you to see that. Sometimes it feels like we push rocks up a hill and it's difficult. The rocks that most women push up are way heavier. It's just a lot harder. Empathy should cause us men, it should cause us to recognize that and do something about it. And if that feels uncomfortable, it's okay. And no one's blaming you because you didn't know. You've always been a guy. You didn't know that. But empathy should cause you to lean in and figure out. This is a really fun one. If you're white, you have an advantage. If you are white, empathy should cause you to intentionally invest in relationships with people who are not like you and see what it's like to not be you. And that's a hard one to do because we are tempted to think that everybody who isn't like us isn't getting it right. And everybody who isn't like us isn't thinking about it correctly, and that isn't true. What is it like to not be you? We'll never know. We'll never know if it isn't for relational empathy. If you're white, it's an advantage. We should stop pretending that it's not. And through empathy, realize what it really looks like to not be. Here's one more. If you're a Christian, that's an advantage in this country. If you're a Christian through empathy, you should realize that we so often expect people who are not Christians to behave like Christians. And if you were to ask a non-Christian, what is it like to be on the other side of Christians? You know what they'll tell you? It's horrible. They'll say, oh, it feels fantastic. It feels like I'm being judged. They'll say Christians are judgmental, they're hypocritical, and they're homophobic. That's what they're going to say. And you know what? They're right. They're right. But they shouldn't be right. As Christians, we should, through empathy, understand what it's like to be on the other side of us, just like Jesus did. And what did Jesus do? When he bumped into people who weren't believers, you know what he did? He just loved them. And he hugged them. And he built relationships with them. And he said, hey, what is it like to be a tax collector? What is it like to be looked down upon? I want to offer you something better. That's what it should look like. You guys want me to put this up? Are you done with that? Are any of you like super pumped you came to church today? It's pretty fun, right? Here's the reality. Listen, I know that this can feel heavy, and the reason it feels heavy is because we don't want to get this wrong. The problem is that we've been accidentally getting it wrong most of our lives because we just didn't know. But I think that's the point of the story. See, I think the question that Jesus wants us to wrestle kind of with is this, that will my privilege be a right or a responsibility? That's the real question. Like, will my privilege be a right or a responsibility? Will I see my advantages as an opportunity to take advantage, or will I see my advantages as something that I can leverage for the benefit of others? That's the real question. And listen, before we finish up, if you think Jesus talking to a Samaritan woman is a big deal, you should read the rest of the story. And I don't mean the Samaritan story. You should go to the end of the Gospels. You should flip to the end of the book of Matthew. Because never in the history of humanity has a person leveraged his power to empower others and leveraged his advantage for the benefit of others more than Jesus. No one has ever done that. At the end of Matthew's document of Jesus' life, he tells us about Jesus being in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's a few hours away from the crucifixion. And he's praying to God, if there's any way around this, I'll take option B, but if not, your will, not my will, be done, because I care too much about humanity's relationship with you to not be a sacrifice for them. So as he's walking out of the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas, the betrayer, walks up with a bunch of guards and a bunch of soldiers, and Matthew saw it. And here's how Matthew wrote about it. Jesus replied to Judas, "Do what you came for, friend," which is so fascinating that he calls him friend, using his advantage for someone who's about to be really disadvantaged. Then the men stepped forward, they seized Jesus, and they arrested him. With that, he keeps going, with that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And then Jesus responds, "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword die by the sword." You know why he pulled his sword out? Because might makes right. That's why. That's why. That's the world that Peter was living in. And then Jesus stops in this moment before he's about to be crucified to teach everybody something. He says, do you think I cannot call on my Father, who I have a pretty good relationship with, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Now, I don't know how powerful you are, but I doubt any of us can snap our finger and have 80,000 angels show up on our behalf. That's Jesus. That's the power and the privilege that he walks around with every single day. Every single day. He continues. But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way? So Jesus, the most powerful person to ever walk the planet, the most powerful person, allowed himself to be arrested. He allowed himself to be beaten. He allowed himself to be flogged. He allowed himself to carry the crossbeam of a huge Roman cross in the most humiliating walk you could imagine, up to the most humiliating moment a human can imagine. And the most painful way to die, on a cross. And you know what kept him on the cross? Your disadvantage. That's what. Because at any moment he could have ended it. At any moment he could have snapped his fingers and had angels. At any moment he could have come down, but you know what he knew? He knew that it was a privilege to leverage his privilege for you. And he knew that it was a privilege to leverage his advantage for those of us who were disadvantaged. And when it comes to our relationship with God, we begin a little bit at a disadvantage because of that selfish, sinful thing in us. And Jesus said, no more. I'm going to die as a sacrifice and create a path for you to have a right standing with God, because I'm going to lay down my power. And here's the point. You see, just like Jesus, for us, it's a privilege to use our privilege too. And it should be a privilege for us to use our privilege. Now, I don't know what your privileges are, and I don't know what your advantages are, but I think the point of John's story is that we're supposed to learn what they are, and through empathy, leverage it to figure out what it's like on the other side of you to the benefit of the person on the other side of you. That's something worth trying. And I think it's something that could actually end some of the isms in the world too.